Hello everyone, and welcome to my tier ranking video of all of the books that I finished in 2024. I have a lot of books I want to get through, so let's just jump right into the screen share. As you can see, my tier list looks a little bit different from what you may have seen on YouTube, and that is because I am doing this in Google Sheets. Prior to clicking record, I had already mapped out all of my books on this document, so I figured since it's already set up, why not just use this? I read a lot of fiction and nonfiction, so I'm going to separate these categories. I'm going to start with fiction, and I have slightly more books in this category, and then I'll end this video with nonfiction. Within these categories, I'm going in the order that I finished the book. I'll be slotting the books into 5 different categories, the first being the S category. This is the seriously life-changing category. A is affected me in a significant way. B is good, but C is I probably could have DNF'd it. And DNF is either I didn't read it from cover to cover or it just wasn't for me right now. The first books I'm going to talk about are 3 books in a trilogy, and that is the Xenogenesis trilogy by Octavia E. Butler. The 3 books in the series are called Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago. These books affected me in a significant way. I read this series very quickly, and I was immersed from the very beginning in this epic sci-fi tale that spans generations. There is so much in this series, so much imagination, so many things that made me think. I've always enjoyed sci-fi, but all of the books that I've read are by male authors. So for example, Ray Bradbury, Andy Weir, and Ted Chiang. And while I love the stories told by these authors as well, these books by Octavia E. Butler really hit differently for me. And I started seeing the value in diversifying my bookshelf, which is something that I haven't really thought about a whole lot in the past. The next book that I'm going to talk about is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. And once again, I did find that this book affected me in a significant way. I read this when I was on vacation in Cuba. I didn't enjoy this book as much as the Hunger Games trilogy, but there was something about how President Snow's character was portrayed. I thought it was very nuanced and interesting to be in the mind of a narcissistic psychopath. I just found it very fascinating, and I could see a lot of layers to this character. That being said, I know this book isn't universally viewed in this way because the people I talked to in my book club who had already read this book, they found the main character of President Snow, or younger Snow before he became president, they found him to be very one-dimensional. Maybe it's when I read it, or maybe due to my experiences in my life, I found this character to be very multidimensional and very interesting. Just the decisions and the thought patterns. Even though I couldn't necessarily identify with this person, I was really curious about him. All of the books in this A category, once I'm done reading them, they stay with me for a little bit, and that's why they're in this category. I started off the year pretty well because the next book I read is also in this A category, and it is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. This book is speculative fiction, probably in, I would say, the fantasy category. I've heard great things about Neil Gaiman as an author, and this is the first book that I've read by him. It takes the reader into this society that exists in the underbelly of London, England, literally below London. And the world building is very interesting. It really drew me in. There were certain passages in this book that really resonated with me as someone who has taken a step back from full-time work, and sometimes I do feel like I'm kind of on the periphery of society. So this book was really interesting to me in that respect, and I would highly recommend it. Next is a book that I put in the B category. It was good, but, and that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. And I would say I really enjoyed the first half of the book where the two main characters are younger, but when they got older and started their careers, I started losing interest in their story a little bit. I didn't feel as invested in the characters as they were making their way through that part of their life. I'm not sure why it lost me, but I definitely didn't connect with the characters as much in the second half of the book. Also, when I finished the book, I just felt very meh about it. So I enjoyed it and it was a good read, but there wasn't any substance for me. Next is another book in the A category, and that is Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez. This book is a series of vignettes from the perspective of many different characters who live in the same community. The setting of the story is in a low-income neighborhood that is also very diverse. So you meet a lot of different people who live in this neighborhood. And as with these types of books, some characters I found more of a connection to than others. I would look forward to reading more about their story, whereas I didn't connect with others in the same way. But overall, this book was very emotionally resonant for me. As someone who has grown up in Toronto, I'm familiar with a lot of the street names, and so this book really drew me in. There was also something that happened in this book, put a dagger in my heart. It was just so sad. I'm not someone who really cries at movies or when reading, but I definitely teared up with this book. It was, again, very emotionally resonant. Next, we have the first book in the C category for me, and that was, unfortunately, Piranesi by Susanna Clark. This is another book that I sped through because I wanted to know what happened next. It started off very intriguing, but it got very repetitive. The world building was interesting, but it was hard for my brain to situate the character in this world. I think this was another book where I enjoyed the first half more than the second half. The second half really trailed off for me. It just got very repetitive and I was waiting for something to happen and nothing ever really happened. I'm kind of sad to put it in the C category because I did think that this book was very imaginative and it had a strong premise. It just wasn't for me. Next, we have another book in the A category, and that is Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. This was such a sweet book, another book that I flew through. I was sad when this book ended because I felt very connected to one of the main characters, which happens to be an octopus. I also love the character of Tova Sullivan. She is an elderly woman, 70 years old, whose husband recently passed away, and she starts working at an aquarium where she encounters this octopus. So it was a really beautiful story about friendship and family, and also had a little bit of a mysterious element to it. I wanted the story to continue, and it definitely hit all the right notes for me. I also haven't read a lot of books where the central character is an elderly woman, and I think I read later that the author based a lot of this character's characteristics on her grandmother, which I thought was really sweet. Next up, we have another trilogy on my A list, and that is the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. This is also a sci-fi series with a lot of really brilliant world building. I felt very immersed in this story, and I felt also very invested in the characters. It takes you on quite an extensive journey, and overall I think I read this series very quickly. Unfortunately, I had to wait for my holds to come up at the library, so I feel like if I had read it straight through, it probably would have been even more impactful for me, but because I had some wait time between the books, I couldn't fly through it as quickly as I wanted to. This series was so impressive to me on so many different levels. It talks a lot about racism and classism. There are also a lot of different relationships that are explored in these books. Overall, I just found them very captivating, and I didn't want this series to end. Next, we have another book on my B list, and that is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This book was another book that I flew through, a sci-fi book that was very riveting, very easy to read as well. It was written in a way that was just like very, very easy to digest, and it was a page turner for sure. The reason it's on my B list is because I didn't connect at all with the ending. I just found it really weird, and I love sci-fi. I love things that are weird, but this one was just like, I don't like this. But up until the point where it got a little bit weird for me and I didn't like where the book was going, I thought it was fantastic. And I still highly recommend this book if you're into science fiction or if you want to start to get into science fiction. This was a very entertaining read, very creative. The next two books are also in my good but category, and you might be surprised to see this duology by Octavia E. Butler. This is the Earthseed duology. I loved Xenogenesis, so I was really looking forward to the series, especially since I had heard so many good things about it. Maybe this was a situation where my expectations were too high going into these books. I found these books a little bit harder to get through. They are based on a religion called Earthseed, so there are a lot of, I guess, what you would call gospel that you read through. And I usually find that sort of thing, whether it be poetry or lyrics to a song, or in this case, gospel from a religion, I find that pulls me out of the story. I don't really like it embedded in prose to such a huge extent, and there was a lot of it in this duology. I found the concept, though, incredibly fascinating and very prescient. These books were published in 1993 and 1998 respectively, and it's quite eerie, some of the things in the books that have come to pass. Next up, we have Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I loved curling up with this book, and I think this is one of the first cozy books I've ever read. I usually gravitate more towards sci-fi and horror, dark stories. I read a lot of true crime when I was in my teenage years, so I don't have a lot of experience with cozy books, and this one was so sweet. I didn't want it to end. The next book is a short story, and it is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. I think you could classify this story as sci-fi. It's very short, but it deals with a lot of big issues, and I don't want to say too much about it because I like to go into speculative fiction with no idea of what the book is about or what the story is about. So I'll just say that it left me thinking a lot about philosophical questions. Next, we have a book in the B category, which is The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides. This definitely was a page turner. It was a psychological thriller. There were a few things in the book that I thought were taking me to a different place, and I wasn't that satisfied with the ending. I am very grateful to my sister, though, for recommending this book because hubby and I both read it, and this is the first time hubby and I have read the same book and we were able to talk about it after. So that was really fun and interesting. I enjoyed it overall, but I feel pretty good about leaving it in the B category. Next, we have the first book in my S category, and that is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. This is the first book in the Monk and Robot series, and I loved this book so much. This is in a genre called hope punk, which is a subcategory of speculative fiction. Wikipedia says works in the hope punk subgenre are about characters fighting for positive change, radical kindness, and communal responses to challenges. I put this book in the seriously life-changing category because I've never read anything like it. Not only is this book cozy and hopeful and optimistic, it also made me think a lot about philosophical questions. This book made me feel like there's a different way of being. I mentioned earlier in this video that I gravitate towards very dark subject matter. That's just my default. I like things that are dark and eerie and dystopian. And this book made me think, what if I read more books like this? Could that change my personality and my mindset? I think I'm already quite an optimistic person, so maybe I do need the darkness to balance that off, but It got me thinking about a lot more than just the story itself, and I'd like to seek out more books in the hope punk category. Next up, we have another trilogy, and this is the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood. It pains me to put something by Margaret Atwood in good but I couldn't put this series any higher because it just wasn't that interesting to me for whatever reason. I'm not sure why I didn't connect with this series, but it took me a while to get through all of the books, and I did consider DNFing it. In the grand scheme of things, I'm glad I read it, which is why I didn't place it in my C category, but I would say that I was expecting more from this series. I was certainly expecting to like it more when I first started it. Next, we have another book in my C category, and that is Weasels in the Attic by Hiroku Oyamada. This is a very short book that's translated from Japanese. This book consists of 3 vignettes, and I thought the vignettes would be told from different perspectives of different characters in the story, but they were all told from one character's perspective, and I didn't really connect with that character. The first thought that came into my mind when I finished this book was, I don't get it, and I also wasn't curious to get it because I just wasn't invested in the character. There were parts of it that were interesting, and I had high hopes for this book when I finished the first vignette because I could see the possibilities, but nothing ever gets resolved. It's very slice of life, which I do usually enjoy. To be quite honest, I could have DNF'd it, and I don't think I would have been missing anything. The next book is a book that hubby recommended to me, and that is They Never Learn by Lane Fargo. This, I find, is in a similar vein to The Silent Patient. It's a page turner. It was really entertaining. It was enjoyable. I liked that hubby read it and recommended it to me so we could talk about it after. That was a lot of fun. With this book, I was more satisfied with the ending, but when it ended, it was just done. It didn't really make that strong of an impression on me, even though I enjoyed reading it. Next up is another book in the B category, and that is The Kill Artist by Daniel Silva. This is the first book in his Gabriel Allen series, and I think he has written over 20 books with this character. This book was very well written, but for whatever reason, I just wasn't drawn into the story. There was something that happened right at the beginning that I thought would factor in later in the book, so I kept thinking about it and waiting for it to reappear, but it didn't, so I guess it was just maybe a red herring. That put me off because it seemed like something that would have been important, that would have been interesting in terms of character building. I initially read this book thinking if I like it, I'm gonna read all the other books in the series, and maybe I will read the second book at some point, but after reading this book, I just needed to do something else. I didn't want to continue with this character. I guess I didn't connect with this character very well. The next book is a reread for me, and that is The Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. I loved this book when I was a teenager. This is Stephen King's foray into fantasy, so very different from his other books, which are usually horror. I loved this book as a teenager, and I read it over and over and over again. There was just something about it that I found very captivating, so I decided I would try to read it again over 20 years later, and for whatever reason, it just wasn't as resonant. I couldn't really remember the book all that well. As I was reading it, I knew that I had read it before, but I couldn't really remember the storyline, so it was like I was reading it for the first time, and it just didn't capture my interest. It was a fine book, but really nothing more than that. I was hoping to get some nostalgia and rediscover some of the magic in this book from when I was a teenager, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Next, we have a book that I loved, and that is Recursion by Blake Crouch. So this is the second book by the same author, and I loved this book. It was very mind-bendy. Again, a sci-fi book. This one deals more with time travel, whereas Dark Matter dealt with alternate realities. Time travel is something that I really enjoy reading about or watching movies about. So this book I had high hopes for, and it did not disappoint. I loved everything about this book. I loved the ending. It really stayed with me, and my brain was very pleasantly tickled throughout. It was definitely a page turner, and it's a book that I highly recommend if you're into sci-fi, especially time travel. Next, we have another short story, and this is Children of the Corn by Stephen King. I enjoyed this. It was definitely interesting, but again, there was nothing about it that really made me think after. For that reason, I put it in B. It was entertaining, but nothing beyond that. Next up, we have another book in the C category, and that is The Running Man by Stephen King. I was surprised by this because I thought I had read this book when I was a teenager, and I also watched the movie way back when. I know they're doing another one, but this was the original adaptation that I watched when I was pretty young. I think I was in grade 4 when I watched this. So I had, again, high hopes for this book. I thought it would be very nostalgic, very exciting. I read this pretty quickly over 4 or 5 days, but I wasn't at any point really into it. I was just basically reading it to finish it. And at the end, I didn't really feel any connection to the story at all. So I feel like I could have DNF'd it. And again, I wouldn't have been missing out on anything. Next, we're going to go back to the A category, and I'm going to talk about The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry by Gabrielle Zevin. This is the second book I've read by this author, and I think she wrote this one earlier. It didn't get as much attention, I don't think, as Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, but I liked it more. Maybe because I'm really into books right now, and this is a story about an owner of a bookshop. I thought it was a really cozy read, and I flew through this book. Unlike Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, with this book, I did feel very invested in the characters, and it made me think a lot about relationships and getting older, love and family. There were a lot of themes in this book that gave me all the feels, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Next, we're going to scroll back to the C category, and I'm going to talk about Butter by Asako Yuzuki. This book is translated from Japanese. It says right on the cover that this is a novel of food and murder. The food bits were fantastic. I really enjoyed those. The murder bits were lacking. There were no murder bits. I went into this book expecting something very different. My friend recommended this book to me, which is why I ended up finishing it, but it was so long and drawn out and, quite frankly, incredibly boring for me. I think this book tries to tackle some big subjects like misogyny, societal beauty standards, and fat phobia, but I found that it didn't really say much about any of those topics. They were just kind of thrown in here and there, and I didn't feel like the author was really saying anything at all. Maybe that was the whole point, to bring up these topics and let the reader formulate their own opinions, but it didn't really have me thinking anything at all about these topics. I thought I would be really triggered by the misogyny, but I was more triggered by the fat phobia, which I thought was interesting. So I do like that the book brings up these topics for the reader to think about, but I didn't need to read this book to think about these topics, and I don't feel like this book added anything to the discussion. I could have definitely DNF'd it because the ending was very underwhelming for me. We're scrolling back and forth here because I have another book in the A category, and that is False Witness by Karen Slaughter. This is the first book that I've read by Karen Slaughter, and it is a page turner. It's a thriller, and I found it very dark and disturbing. I flew through this book, and I had to know what would happen next. And this is a book where I wouldn't exactly say I didn't want it to end because it came to a very satisfying conclusion, but this book stayed with me. I thought about this book a lot. I enjoyed this book so much that I read another book by Karen Slaughter, and this one was Girl Forgotten. False Witness is a standalone book, and Girl Forgotten is displayed as a standalone book on Karen Slaughter's website, but as I started reading this book, I realized that Andrea Oliver is actually a character from one or perhaps more of Karen Slaughter's previous books. That being said, I didn't feel like I was missing anything as I went through this book, and this book, again, was a page turner, but I didn't find that the story grabbed me as much as False Witness. I just didn't connect with this story as much, so it was good, it was an enjoyable read, but again, nothing beyond that. The last book that I'm going to talk about in the fiction category is in my S tier, and that is the sequel to the Monk and Robot duology called A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. I loved this book so much. I loved it more than the first one, so of course it had to be in my S tier. It was just such a beautiful book, and I got emotional at multiple times in the book. I didn't cry, but I came very, very close, especially towards the end. It wasn't for sadness though, because this is a very hopeful and optimistic book. It was just the relationship between the main characters, their friendship, their loyalty towards one another, their love for one another. It just got me very emotional. Even as I'm talking now, I'm feeling the emotion come up. And once again, in this book, I feel like there were a lot of philosophical questions that I could ponder, and I highlighted a lot of passages in the book that really resonated with me. So definitely a life-changing series. This might be the longest video I've ever filmed. I had to take a break to have lunch, and now I am ready to dive into nonfiction. Let's start with a book that made it to my A ranking, and that is Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. I filmed an entire review on this book, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but it definitely affected me in a significant way. Next, we have my first book in the DNF category, and that is Drink by Anne Dowsett Johnston. I only read about 15% of this book, and it wasn't because it was a bad book or anything like that. It just wasn't what I was looking for at the time. I was interested in reading books about quitting alcohol, but this was more of a memoir, and I was looking for more of a self-help book, so that's why I DNF'd it. And you may have already noticed I didn't DNF any books in the fiction category. All my DNFs were in nonfiction. Moving back to the A category, This Naked Mind by Annie Grace. This is the self-help book about quitting alcohol that I was looking for. It was repetitive in a way that I found very helpful. I didn't quit drinking after reading this book. I've made a conscious decision that I'm going to have a drink when I want to, but I find myself thinking differently about alcohol now, and more often than not, I'll actually choose not to drink, versus before reading this book, in the same situation, I probably would have had a drink. So this book definitely affected me in a really meaningful way. Next, we have a book that I absolutely loved, and that is Build the Life You Want by Arthur C. Brooks and Oprah Winfrey. I read this book in 2 to 3 days, and it was filled with things that I had already implemented in my life or that I was thinking about implementing in my life. I think there were a few things that were new to me that I wanted to try, although I can't remember them off the top of my head now. I read this book back in March of 2024, so it's been almost a year. But I liked this book so much that I decided to buy a copy. So I have this on my bookshelf now to refer to, and I will definitely read it again down the road. We're gonna go back to the DNF category now, and I'm going to talk about The Teachings of the Tao by Eva Wong. I was really excited about this book because I had it in my mind that I was going to learn all about the Tao Te Ching, and it just didn't resonate with me. I'm so sad because I was literally so excited about learning this ancient Chinese philosophy. But this book was very well written, and I would definitely pick it up again if I wanted to learn more about the Tao Te Ching. I ended up reading about 50% of it before DNFing it. Also in the DNF category is Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahanda Yogananda. This is the third time I've tried to read this book, and for whatever reason, I just can't get into it. I'm really sad because I wanted to read this book so badly, and every time I put it down, I thought one day I'm going to pick it up again. I ended up reading 25% of it, and I'm going to DNF it for now and probably forever. Next, we have a book on my C tier, and that is The Life Council by Laura Tremaine. This is another book that was recommended to me, so I wanted to finish it. This was all about friendship, and perhaps I wanted wanted more of a self-help book on friendship, whereas this is more, I would say, memoir style, but structured like a self-help book. I found it difficult to read because of the categories of friendships. I found myself comparing my relationships to the ones that the author had, and also trying to fit my relationships into the buckets that she put forth in the chapters. There were aspects of the book that I liked, but overall, I didn't find myself open to the author's suggestions and wanting to try new things in my life. Instead, I found myself quite resistant and a little bit defensive. Next, we have a book on my B list, and that is 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. I was surprised that this was on my B list because I had heard such rave reviews about this book. I've heard that it is paradigm shifting and gives you a completely different perspective on life. For me, it didn't really do that, mostly because I found it very similar to Essentialism by Greg McKeown. But 4,000 Weeks I found had a little bit of a less uplifting tone. And in case you're curious about the title, 4,000 weeks is the number of weeks in the average human lifespan. There were a lot of interesting messages in the book and a lot that I could relate to, but I just didn't really enjoy the way the information was presented. Another book I was expecting to love was Same as Ever by Morgan Housel. I loved The Psychology of Money. It's one of my favorite and most recommended books in finance, so I was very much looking forward to his second book. This book was a bit of a mishmash for me. There were things about it that were really interesting, but I found it to be a little bit all over the place, and it didn't have as much cohesiveness as The Psychology of Money. Again, maybe expectations are at work here, but I did not enjoy this book as much as I thought I would. The next book I've talked about already, and I'm also going to talk about the follow-up at the same time, and that is Essentialism and Effortless, both by Greg McKeown. Essentialism was a reread because I had read it for the first time in 2018, and Effortless was released more recently, and this was my first time reading that book. I loved both of these books, and I had really high expectations for Effortless. I think I might actually like Effortless even more than Essentialism because I found that in Effortless, the author put in a lot of ideas for implementation that made it a lot easier to digest. Whereas Essentialism talks about focusing on things that are important to you, but it doesn't really go into the how of it. So I found it a little bit confusing when I first read it, and even on the second read, I had a little bit more clarity, but the examples didn't resonate with me. Even still, both of these books made it to my A tier. Next is a book that reads like fiction, and that is The Art Thief by Michael Finkel. This book is about a real-life art thief, Stefan Breitweiser. The entire story had me captivated. If you're into fiction, specifically if you're into heists or thrillers, I would highly recommend The Art Thief as a foray into nonfiction. It's a page turner. And after I finished this book, I spent quite a bit of time looking into the people who were featured in this book, just trying to learn more about them, trying to learn about the artwork and the museums and how they got away with it. It was just really fascinating. And anytime nonfiction does that for me, gets me curious and interested about things that I don't normally think about, I consider that to be something on my A list. The next book is on my B list, and that is You Could Make This Place Beautiful by Maggie Smith. I'm really torn about putting this book on my B list because it is so beautifully written. Maggie Smith is a poet, and this book definitely reads like poetry. It's a memoir, and she's basically looking at one event in her life through multiple lenses and using different forms to do that. The event that she's studying is her divorce, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful book. The reason it's on my B list is because it was so long. The chapters just went on forever, and they're very, very short chapters, so very easy to get through, but it was long. I think if this book were half the length, it would be on my A list because it was just so beautifully written. Next, we have a book called Everything in Its Place. It was formerly called Work Clean, and it's by Dan Charnas. The premise of this book is really interesting. It takes the mise en place concept, which is basically everything in its place as applied to the way a chef prepares the mise en place for a night of service in a professional kitchen. It takes those concepts and applies them to the life of an ordinary person. So this book is interesting to me because I'm interested in chefs, I'm interested in food documentaries about professional kitchens and the like. So I had high hopes for this book. It was interesting. There were a lot of good takeaways from the book, but I feel like, again, it was a little bit too long and it probably could have been a blog post or a series of blog posts. I'm scrolling way back because we have an S tier book, and that is Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay C. Gibson. This book was seriously life-changing. I have an entire review on this book, so I won't go into detail here, but I will link that video down below. We're gonna go from S tier to DNF, and I'm gonna talk about a book called Food Isn't Medicine by Joshua Woolrich. This DNF is simply because I didn't read this book from cover to cover. I borrowed this book with something very specific in mind that I wanted to read about, and that was intermittent fasting. So I read the bits about that and I skimmed the chapter titles to see if there was anything else I was interested in, and there wasn't. So DNF in the category of nonfiction will happen quite frequently because I often look through a book to see what parts I want to read and then the other parts I'm not interested in. So I'm simply not reading them from cover to cover. But that doesn't mean that I thought it was a bad book or even that it wasn't right for me. It was just I got what I wanted from it and I didn't need the rest. Next, we have another book in the Emotionally Immature series, and that is Disentangling from Emotionally Immature People, also by Lindsay C. Gibson. I thought this book had a lot of good things about it. It was structured in a way so that you could flip to certain chapters and read those, read the ones you're essentially interested in. I did read this from cover to cover, but because it was laid out in a way that wasn't really meant to be read from cover to cover, I found it a little bit disjointed, and I much preferred the structure of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, which made it into my S tier, because that one you could very easily read from cover to cover and it was very cohesive. Next are two books in the DNF category, which I'll talk about at the same time because I treated them in a similar way. The first is Goblin Mode by Michaela Coyle, and the second is The Art of Frugal Hedonism by Annie Razor Rowland and Adam Grubb. So both of these books were really interesting to me. There were a lot of good parts. I read about 35% of Goblin Mode and skimmed the rest, and with Art of Frugal Hedonism, I read about 15% and skimmed the rest. I think these would be really fun books to have as reference. They're just not the sort of books that I would read from cover to cover. Moving back up to the A category, we have On Community by Casey Plett. I read this book when I was going through the community chapter of my own book, Authenblissity Reset, and it was so interesting and very helpful. The author talks about a lot of different communities, but also a lot of facets of communities. So I feel like this book really broadened my definition of community, allowed me to see it in a different way, while also echoing a lot of thoughts that I've had about community myself. This is the type of book that leaves you with more questions than answers, but I don't think that's a bad thing, especially with a really complicated and nuanced topic like community. Next, we have another book in my A tier, and that is Your Money or Your Life by Vicky Robin and Joe Dominguez. Your Money or Your Life is a book that I highly recommend, and it's one of my favorites in the personal finance category. It talks about the FIRE movement, which stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. If one of your priorities in life is financial independence or financial freedom, I would highly recommend this book. I read this book after I left my full-time job, so I had already put in place a lot of the practices that are outlined in this book, so there is a little bit of confirmation bias at work here. But reading this was so helpful to me at the time because I had so much doubt and confusion about leaving a 2-decade-long career behind, that this book was exactly what I needed to help reassure me that I was on the right path. Moving right along, we have another book in the Emotionally Immature series, and this one is Self-Care for Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, again by Lindsay C. Gibson. I loved this book. It wasn't quite as impactful as the first book that I read in this series, but there were a lot of nuggets in here. I pretty much highlighted the entire book. The format was very similar to the one that I had on my B list, Disentangling from Emotionally Immature People, but the difference was that I found this book more helpful. I found that there were a lot of practical strategies that I could use. We've come to the last book in this video, and we're gonna go back to the S tier. I don't know if you'll be surprised to see this or not, but this is my book, Authenblissity Reset. Of course, this is going to be on the S tier because this book has changed my life. Not only the process of writing the book, but going through it as a reader last year. I finished in October of 2024. It was a year-long journey of self-reflection, and I had so many realizations, so many aha moments. That is it for my first ever tier ranking video where I ranked all of the books that I finished in 2024. This was a marathon to record, and I'm sure it'll be a marathon to watch as well. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Now that you've seen my tier ranking, I would love to hear down below if you have any book recommendations for me. I have a huge TBR list, but I would be happy to add a few more, especially if you think I would enjoy the book. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I will see you very soon in another one. Until then, please take care and bye for now.